All right. Hello, everyone. How's everybody doing? Let's see. Got the slides all set up. Good, good. I hope you all had a nice long weekend. Mm. So today's topic is behaviorism. And we'll be looking at, predominantly philosophical behaviorism. So perhaps not the variety of behaviorism that you might have expected. Um, of course, I think probably outside of philosophy, I mean, well, within philosophy as well, but outside of philosophy, certainly, the variety of behaviorism that you're probably familiar with um, is behaviorist psychology, right? The idea that um, observable behavior is the only thing that matters when it comes to the science of the mind. We will be talking about that a little bit at the start of today's lecture and toward the end of today's lecture. But what we're really going to be engaging with is philosophical behaviorism, which is a little bit different, as we'll see. Although the two do have a sort of intertwined history. So let's get started. This is how William James, the American uh, philosopher and psychologist from working around the late 19th, I think a little bit into the early 20th century. This is how he characterized psychology, which was around this time beginning to emerge um, as a sort of field of scientific inquiry of its own. William James says um, psychology is the science of mental life, both of its phenomena and of their conditions. The phenomena are such things as we call feelings, desires, cognitions, reasonings, decisions, and the like. And although there were sort of streams of parallel, um, uh, what we'll call parallel streams of psychology at the time, um, for example, there were early behaviorists like Ivan Pavlov. You might have heard of Pavlov's dogs, right? The dogs who um, salivated when the bell rang. This was all the discovery of what we now call classical conditioning in psychology, right? Ivan Pavlov was a Russian scientist, had these dogs in his laboratory with a little bell on their kennel, right? And so every day when he would come in to feed the dogs, the bell would ring as he opened the door. The dogs would, of course, salivate when they uh, when they realized that there was food, right? One day, Pavlov goes into the lab without the food. The bell rings and the dog begins to salivate. And Pavlov realized that the dogs had associated this conditioned stimulus, the bell ringing, with an unconditioned stimulus, food. So their behavior, salivating, was associated, thanks to this pairing between the unconditioned stimulus, the food, and the conditioned stimulus, the bell. They began to salivate when hearing the bell, even though there was no food. That was the discovery of classical conditioning. And well, that was kind of the foundation of behaviorist psychology, um, which was later sort of brought to fruition thanks to J.B. Watson and B.F. Skinner. So that was one stream of psychology. Behaviorism was there. There was psychophysics, right? The psychophysicists tried to work out the relationship between objective measurable stimuli and subjective conscious experiences. So we're talking about things like the relationship between sound pressure and perceived loudness, or luminosity and perceived brightness, right? Um, the psychophysicists, unlike the behaviorists, were interested in subjective aspects of our psychology, as was James, right? The phenomena of our mental life that he has in mind are, again, feelings, desires, cognitions, reasoning, decisions, and so on. So not just, cognitions and reasonings, the sorts of things that I don't know, like a cognitive psychologist would um, would study nowadays, James was interested in things like emotions and conscious experiences. James, in fact, is the thinker who coined the term stream of consciousness. Um, so, psychology, in a big way, not just from James, but also I think from the approach that the psychophysicists adopted, um, placed mental phenomena kind of at the center of what they were interested in trying to learn about, trying to study. That really changes when J.B. Watson comes on the scene. I mean, we have Ivan Pavlov and Pavlov's dogs, but Watson, an American behaviorist, he said the following of psychology. He characterized psychology as, quote, a purely objective experimental branch of natural science. Its theoretical goal is the prediction and control of behavior. And this was again a matter of understanding learning as the product of conditioning. And conditioning is, on classical conditioning, a sort of association and reinforcement between an unconditioned stimulus and a conditioned stimulus. So, like Pavlov's dogs, right? You don't need to condition the dogs to salivate when you put a bowl of dog food in front of them. But by associating that unconditioned stimulus with the conditioned stimulus, the bell, they became conditioned to salivate when the bell rang. Later, B.F. Skinner would take it further with operant conditioning. This is conditioning that involves sort of like non-natural behaviors. So we're talking like rats learning to run mazes or pull levers to get a reward, pigeons sitting in what's called a Skinner box, learning to push different buttons to get a reward, right? That's operant conditioning. Um, and what the behaviorists, particularly the behaviorist psychologists, did was they began to treat psychology as the science of behavior, not as the science of or the study of mental life, of its phenomena and their conditions. So very unlike the the sort of direction that James sets up for psychology, the behaviorists go in a very different direction. And that's why, even to this day, you'll hear talk of psychology as behavioral science, which is really interesting to me. After all, who can tell me a little bit about the etymology of the word psychology? I know that there's, you know, you this is really an illustrative exercise more than anything else. Um, Sometimes the original meanings of the words we use kind of morph, and a word like psychology in the way we use it now has a different meaning than what we might be led to if we examine its etymology. But let's see. Someone in the chat. Psyche is the soul. That's right, Cole. A little rhyme there. Poet, and I'm a poet, and I didn't even know it. Yeah, psyche is the soul. Psyche comes from psyche, the ancient Greek for soul, and the ology part comes from logos. Um, Remember back when we were talking about Plato, right? The rational soul is the part of the soul that has logos, which could mean reason. It could mean like true speech, like language. Um, and so psychology, if you just look at the parts of the parts of the word, it's the study of the mind, the science of the mind. But behaviorism treats it as behavioral science rather than mind science. And behaviorism in psychology remained the dominant paradigm until the cognitive revolution. Um, in psychology, this was a sort of shift from a behaviorist approach um, towards studying the mind as an information processing system. Um, and beyond that, psychologists started to pay closer attention to inner mental states again, which they hadn't really done since James or since the psychophysicists. Not Not really. So you get things like studies, like mental rotation studies, where people have to mentally rotate two images to see if they're the same or different, or like these cognitive map studies, where we have people imagine a map or an object. And get them to start at a certain point and then sort of scan the object in their mind's eye. We find that the farther away some part of the image is from where they told them to start looking, the longer it takes them to report on what they are envisioning. So there's a sort of linear relationship between degree of rotation or distance from the focal point to the target, which shows which might be indicative of these sorts of mental representations being imagistic as opposed to something like digital. You don't need to worry about that. But the point is that with the cognitive revolution in psychology, psychologists started paying closer attention to mental states again. The cognitive revolution actually, in a big way, got going in behaviorism. But behaviorist psychologists were some of the initiators, like Edward Tolman and his rat studies. He had to explain how it is that these rats who had never been rewarded for running the maze seemed to learn the layout of the maze without any association and reinforcement. It turned out these rats were using a sort of mental map that they were building as they seemingly wandered aimlessly through the mazes. And then, of course, um, from all sorts of other fields, we get contributions to the cognitive revolution. So we're talking linguistics. Noam Chomsky's review of B.F. Skinner's book Verbal Behavior is a sort of watershed moment in the decline of behaviorism, just like Tolman's rat studies. Um, Functionalism, uh, AI, computer science, all of that stuff dealt with the sort of discrete representations that are transformed according to rules, to algorithms. Maybe our minds work like that too, right? So there's a lot of reasons why the cognitive revolution happened and why we got away from behaviorism. We're going to look at the downfall of philosophical behaviorism today. We're going to look at a philosophical form of behaviorism. Now, I want to get this out of the way, as Kim does, just because we're going to do a sort of whirlwind tour of uh, philosophical behaviorism and see why it doesn't work and why later philosophical behaviorism doesn't work. That does not mean that behavior is not important to psychology or to the cognitive sciences, right? Even James acknowledged the importance of behavior. James wrote, the pursuance of future ends and the choice of means for their attainment are thus the mark and criterion of the presence of mentality in a phenomenon. We all use this test to discriminate between an intelligent and a mechanical performance. We impute no mentality to sticks and stones because they never seem to move for the sake of anything. So, intentional behavior for James is a mark of the mental, right? Remember when we looked at chapter 1 in Kim, we talked about a number of candidates for the mark of the mental. Intentionality is one. It's a big one. That's Brentano's thesis. But that sense of intentionality means that we're talking about states that are about something. In this sense, um, we're talking about um, acting on the basis of reasons, right? Behavior is the action of an agent. Whereas, like occurrences, like rocks rolling down hills, that's not agentive. Yeah, you're right, Grant. Yeah, Brentano's thesis says intentionality is the mark of the mental. But again, just to reiterate, intentionality for Brentano is states is like mental states are states that bear content. They're representational. James says, well, we move for the sake of something. And what he means is that we have reasons for doing what we do, whereas rocks and trees don't, right? Um, So the introspective approach that James emphasized, this is what the whole stream of consciousness thing is about, kind of fell out of favor thanks to behaviorism. It did come back, but behaviorism still casts a very long shadow within psychology. And that's why you'll still hear talk of psychology as the science of behavior and not as the science of mental life, as James thought of it. So, a question that concerns Kim in this chapter, and which we're concerned with, is what is the relation between mind and behavior? Now, that's the title of the chapter, after all, mind and behavior, not mind as behavior. So, what's the relationship here between the mental and behavior? Well, if you're a behaviorist psychologist like Watson or Skinner, you think that behaviors are the only observable data that matter. If you're a behaviorist psychologist, you probably don't think that um, self-reports, for example, matter, right? Um, because they're not directly observable. They're not publicly accessible. So I can say like, I can report to you like I'm imagining something. I'm imagining a red apple. Okay, great. But that's not publicly observable. My mental imagery is not publicly observable. My behavior is. So for a behaviorist psychologist, what matters is publicly observable behavior. Philosophical behaviorists are a little more, well, I don't know. Their position is stronger. For philosophical behaviorists, behavior is constitutive of mentality. There's nothing over and above mentality beyond behavior. So that's the difference, roughly speaking, between the two. Okay, any questions so far before we get on to the Cartesian theater and the beetle in the box? Okay, so far so good then. Good. Now, Kim is going to tell us about a very natural way of thinking about the mind. This is the theater metaphor, or what Daniel Dennett calls the Cartesian theater. Note that this is not um, anything that Descartes actually claimed. Um, I think Daniel Dennett chooses this term because the notion that the mind is a theater accords nicely with Descartes' dualistic picture of the mental, for reasons that you'll see in a moment. But just note that Descartes did not use the theater metaphor. It's actually due to Daniel Dennett. And it's a way of describing, again, a very natural, a very intuitive way of looking at the mind. So, what is the Cartesian theater? Well, mental events. So, our perceptions and sensations, our thoughts, our emotions, our reasonings, right? All of those phenomena of mental life take place on this sort of stage or screen. And you are the audience, an audience of one, and that one is you. So that's the mental theater or the Cartesian theater. It's a very natural way to think of the mind. I mean, think about it. Like just reflect on your experience right now, on your conscious experience right now. You're probably having a visual experience, perhaps of some screen in front of you, your laptop, your desktop, maybe your smartphone or a tablet. And then beyond that, there's a background of some kind, right? For me, I've got my laptop in front of me, and then behind my laptop is the kitchen. That's what's on the screen. I might hear noises, even though I have my headphones on. My dog could begin barking at any moment. That would be part of the show in the Cartesian theater. In other words, everything in the stream of consciousness is like a play or a movie that's happening on the stage or screen. And we, the audience, are who it's happening to. We are who is experiencing the show in the Cartesian theater. Now, what do you make of this metaphor? And do you see any problems with it? I mean, perhaps you think it is quite a natural way of thinking about how the mind works. Do any of you share that view? Like, yeah, okay, my experience is kind of like a movie in the head, as it were. Yeah, good. It does seem accurate, but there are problems with it. One problem is that if there is a theater in the mind, well, Shannon, that's a good question. I think that maybe there's a different kind of show going on. If you're blind, for example, maybe vision isn't a part of the show, but your other senses are. That's kind of what I think. Of course, I don't know. Well, no, you don't see that in the theater, but try and expand beyond just the visual sense, the beyond vision, and think of yourself as, uh, if not a person in the audience, the pilot of a giant meat robot. So think back to they're made out of meat. So I'm a meat robot, and up here is not a member of the audience, but the pilot of the meat robot. Maybe it works like that. Um, does this mean the audience cannot influence the show? Well, let's bracket. I mean, that's a good question. That could be. Um, I think we can set that aside. I'm going to say yes. I believe we can. Again, if instead of a theater, we think of ourselves as big meat robots and the mind is like the pilot of the robot, then yeah, there's a sense in which I'm controlling things. Um, but we don't need to worry too much about that for now. That will be a worry later in the course, though, definitely. Cole says, I think it sort of implies it's not super strong if you can decode what's going on physically at a super advanced level. Maybe it's not private. Maybe, like if I understand your comment correctly, if I were to scan your brain with a sufficiently sophisticated scanning device, I might be able to, in a sense, see what's in your mental theater. Maybe, right? Yeah. And we're kind of getting close to that. But it's not perfect, right? So here are like it does seem like a natural way to look at things, I think is the sense I'm getting from the chat. But there are problems, which I'll tell you about after I answer Timothy's question. Go ahead, Timothy.
I was gonna say like maybe if you like drinking coffee in the morning or you drink alcohol, then like that would mean like the theater or the show is like kind of affecting your how you see the show or like
Yeah.
it's like
Yeah,
kind of
exactly.
a little
Like
too immersive maybe.
the show would change
Yeah.
depending on what mind-altering substances you've imbibed,
I'm
right?
sure there are other examples, but I can think of them on like in the
Yeah,
few
well
minutes.
that
So.
those are good examples, right? I mean, and whatever's going on, whether you're talking a theater or the meat robot, you are the you are the thing to whom it's happening, right? But there are some problems. So one of the reasons why Dennett calls this the Cartesian theater, even though it's not a view that Descartes actually held, is because this natural sort of way of thinking about it has a very big problem. And that problem is that there is a sort of special time and place within the brain or within the mind where it all comes together. The idea that there is a stage and an audience, at least based on what we know about how the brain works, the idea that there is a stage with an audience, a stage, air quotes, and an audience, air quotes, cannot be how it works based on what we know about the brain. So, one problem is there's no special time and place where it all comes together. And we have mental phenomena or consciousness. And the reason I say that is because the brain is massively parallel, and if there is a physical basis to mentality in the brain, which I believe there is, it's not like there's a part of the brain where conscious experience happens. No, it seems to be a massively parallel thing distributed throughout the whole brain. So that's something that Kim doesn't really talk about, but which I think is worthy of mentioning. Another problem is, um, okay, so if my experience is really this, these happenings on this screen to an audience of one, or all of my screens and devices in my meat robot cockpit. And well, okay, then how do I explain how it works for the audience member or the pilot of the meat robot? Do they have a little theater in their heads? Does the meat robot, is the meat robot with the little pilot inside, does that pilot have a little pilot inside of his head? And does it continue on ad infinitum? That's called the homunculus problem. And it's a problem because it's an infinite regress. And whenever we find ourselves facing an infinite regress, that means we got to go back to the drawing board and we've got to rethink some of our fundamental assumptions, right? So there's a couple problems with this metaphor that Kim doesn't really raise, but I think it's important for you to be aware of. Um, Another problem raised by this picture of the mind, and this is what Kim does want to deal with, is solipsism. So the problem is if the mind does work this way, like if I have, maybe it doesn't work like a theater. Maybe it doesn't work like I'm the pilot of a giant meat robot. But maybe one thing that's true in both of these analogies is that my mental experiences, my mental states, everything that goes on in my mind is private. Only I have direct knowledge of it. Um, and if this is really the case, then knowledge of other minds seems impossible. And that's solipsism. Solipsism is the idea that well, I guess let's call we got strong and weak solipsism. So strong solipsism might be like no other minds besides my own exist. Descartes was actually accused of this, right? He's meditating, he's working through his dream argument and his demon argument, and the one thing he can know with certainty is I am, I exist. That is necessarily true whenever I'm thinking it or whenever I utter it. No matter whether his senses deceive him or some evil genius is deceiving him. Oh, well, Mr. Descartes, you sound like a solipsist because the only thing that you can know with certainty is that you exist, and that you are a thinking thing. Descartes wasn't a solipsist, but it is a problem, right? So let's call strong solipsism the idea that there are no other minds. And maybe weak solipsism, there might be other minds, but how do we know about them? Related to what we call in philosophy the problem of other minds. How do we know there are other minds out there? How could we come to know the contents of those minds? If the mind works like the theater metaphor makes it sound like it works, then we've got this problem of other minds. We've got the problem of solipsism that we have to contend with. So what do we do? Well, behavior. We use behavior. We try to infer um, what's going on in one's mind on the basis of behavior. So imagine two different cases, right? Your roommate is listening to a weather report, and the weather report says it's going to rain. And so you predict on that basis that um, your roommate's going to look for her umbrella. And then she does. Great. There's a lot that's publicly observable there, not just her behavior, but the weather report that she's listening to. It's a little bit different than the case of your roommate, I don't know, stubbing her toe and crying out in pain. Um, in the first case, you can kind of infer that your roommate believes it is going to rain and does not want to get wet because you have a lot more information to go on, not just her behavior, but the the weather report that she's listening to. So even though you don't have direct access to the contents of her mind, It's pretty easy to infer on the basis of her behavior what she believes and what she desires. If your roommate cries out in pain, that pain is private in the sense that we were talking about earlier. So, can you know what it's like? For example, can you know what it's like for your roommate who's just, I don't know, stubbed her toe or something? Um, you can infer that she's behaving as if she's in pain, but do you know exactly what it's like, exactly what her experience is like in the same way that you know what your own experience would be like stubbing your toe? What do you think? Good. That's right. Why not? Well, yeah. I mean, how do I know that my pain is the same as your pain? I can't really. I could make an inference on the basis of behavior, but how do I know that your pain feels like my pain? Maybe your pain feels like what itches feel like to me. Yeah. And some people have different pain tolerances. Like I remember reading a few years ago that redheads require more anesthesia when they undergo surgery and I think this is to do with genetics. Um, so yeah, interesting. So perhaps there's different pain tolerance. Mind you, we have to be careful with this, right? Because historically, certain groups were believed to have different pain tolerances for pseudo-scientific reasons. um, People of color, right? In the age of scientific racialism, the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries when Europeans were exploring and colonizing and doing all that stuff, there were scientific racialists who justified um, the treatment of enslaved persons in part by claiming that they were sort of naturally suited to be slaves, right? On the basis that they were stronger and felt pain less. Um, which is, again, I cannot emphasize enough, is not the case. But it is interesting that that redheads seem to have different pain tolerances. So, but we have to be careful because there is this unfortunate historical thing to keep in mind, right? Um, but really, no matter who we're talking about, I cannot be certain of what pain feels like for you the same way that I can be certain what it's like for me because it's private. It's a bit like Wittgenstein's beetle in the box. This is Ludwig Wittgenstein here. I have to find a better picture. But Wittgenstein was arguably one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century. And in his book, The Philosophical Investigations, he makes the point that Kim is trying to make using the parable of the beetle in the box. So he wrote, suppose everyone had a box with something in it. We call it a beetle. No one can look into anyone else's box. And everyone says he knows what a beetle is only by looking at his beetle. Here it would be quite possible for everyone to have something different in his box. So let's imagine we've all got boxes. We've all got beetle boxes. What's in my box? Well, could be anything. Doesn't even have to be a beetle. We all use this word beetle to refer to what is in our boxes. Like, I use pain to refer to my subjective experience of pain. You use pain to refer to yours. And it might seem like we're talking about the same thing. But it could be possible that we have something different in our boxes. Maybe I say beetle, you say beetle. We use the word beetle in a way that it seems like we all know what we're talking about. But in my box, I have a rhinoceros beetle. In your box, you have something entirely different, a Volkswagen beetle. Someone else has, I don't know, John Lennon or Paul McCartney in their box, right? And we're all using this word beetle to refer to what's in our boxes. And we think it refers to the same thing, but it's entirely possible that within our boxes, we all have something quite different. And really, the same is the case with the mental, right? I say, ouch, I'm in pain. You say, ouch, I'm in pain. We think we're referring to the same thing, but it's quite possible that what I experience as pain, you experience as an itch or a tickle, and I'd have no way of knowing, right? Because again, it's quite possible that we all have something different in our little beetle boxes. Make sense? Yeah, Cole. I mean, that's an interesting point you raise. That's connected with something that we'll talk about later on in the class called the inverted spectrum. I think this is one of those like way back in the early days of YouTube. This was one of those big viral videos. I think it was Vsauce. Remember Vsauce talking about science and stuff? Anyway, one of their big early videos that really blew up was on the inverted spectrum, right? Like, okay, let's do an experiment, right? Like, okay, the banana. This is the banana of philosophy that we'll use. Now, I see the banana is yellow, but you might see it as a different color. Maybe you see it as blue. But I use the word yellow to refer to this. When you look at the banana, it is what I would see as blue, but you use the word yellow just like I do. So we could have completely different visual experiences of this banana and not have any idea because I'm using the word yellow to refer to this color. You're using the word yellow to refer to the color that you experience. That color is different than the one I experience, but we'd have no way of knowing. So the inverted spectrum. We'll talk about this more as we. I think it's our unit on functionalism. One of those lectures where we'll get into the inverted spectrum argument. But you see the problem illustrated by Wittgenstein's beetle in the box, right? Mental states are private. Behavior is publicly observable in a way that um, mental states are not. Just like the beetle in the box is not publicly observable. So that's the analogy. So behavior is publicly observable. Unlike the Beatles, unlike the theater, it is not private. Behavior is also agentive. So um, if I decide, like, oh, I have a question for the professor, professor, my hand is up, right? If I raise my arm to ask a question, like as William James said, if I raise my arm for the sake of something, namely to ask a question, that's behavior. If someone raises my arm for me, that's not behavior. Imagine someone sitting in class wants to ask a question, but they're too shy. So instead of raising their own hand, they grab my hand and put it up in the air. Uh, my hand going up is not my behavior. It would be the other person's behavior. Or maybe there's a mad scientist who's put a chip in my brain and he can control my arms. So I'm sitting in class and my arm goes up. Professor says, question. I say, no, that's just the mad scientist. Please disregard. In that case, my raising of my arm is not agentive behavior because the action didn't originate within me, the agent. Um, Now, behavior does not necessarily have to be intentional in the sense that it's done for a purpose. Um, Sneezing could be a sort of behavior, I suppose. Um, or I suppose I could raise my hand just because. Like maybe I'm not in class. I just think, oh, I'm just gonna put my arm up. Nice, okay, yeah. Doesn't have to be done for a specific purpose, but the action is still caused by me. So it's agentive in the sense that I am acting on the basis of like I am the cause of my own actions. Um, but maybe I don't have a specific purpose in mind, right? All of this is to say that behavior is different from happenings or occurrences, like the mad scientist raising my arm. Or I guess the textbook example would be if you go to the doctor and the doctor takes one of those little patellar hammers and taps you on the knee and your leg moves. That is not an action. That's not behavior. That's just an occurrence or a happening. So we understand behavior, what behavior is. Yes? So let's look at a couple of different examples of different kinds of behavior that Kim talks about on pages 66 and 67. What kinds of behaviors could we talk about? Well, maybe we could talk about physiological reactions and responses. For example, perspiration, salivation, coughing, increase in the pulse rate, rising blood pressure. So, all physiological reactions. Those could be a kind of behavior. Bodily movements, walking, running, raising your hand, opening a door, throwing a baseball, maybe a cat scratching at the door, a rat running through a tea maze, me picking up my cup of coffee and taking a sip. Um, Actions involving bodily motions, greeting a friend, writing an email, going shopping, writing a check, attending a concert. Um, those are complex, right? I can raise a hand, but why am I raising the hand? Maybe I'm greeting a friend. Maybe I'm on my bicycle and I'm signaling a left turn. Um, why am I opening the door? Maybe I'm leaving to go shopping. Maybe I'm letting a friend into the house, right? So so category number three, actions that involve a complex of bodily motions are a little bit more, they're more complicated than just mere movements like, you know, scratching your chin. Then there are actions that don't involve overt bodily motions: judging, reasoning, guessing, calculating, deciding, intending. These are kinds of behaviors that are like mental behaviors. I guess they could involve some bodily motions. Maybe if I'm counting, I might do some taps, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But but it's not the same as writing an email where I've got complex series of actions originating from my fingertips on the keyboard. Even though I might be reasoning like, how do I phrase this email? I want to make sure I sound polite, not too formal, etc., etc. Right? So those are some different kinds of actions. Now remember, for the behaviorists, we want our behaviors to be publicly observable. Now, which of these are publicly observable? Only the first two. Can we see why? Well, let's look at number four. Actions that don't involve overt bodily motions, like if I'm judging, reasoning, guessing, etc., that's taking place in the mental theater, as it were. So, those are not publicly observable behaviors. Like I could be sitting there like this, and you won't know what I'm thinking about. I could be thinking, what should I say in that email that I have to write? I could be thinking, what should I do for my lecture on behaviorism? I could be thinking, what should I do for dinner? And how much will it cost? I could order pizza. That might be expensive. Or I could stay in and make soup. That wouldn't cost me as much because I have the ingredients in the fridge. That's all private, not publicly observable, right? I could even be sitting there like this and not be thinking about anything at all. So these actions that don't involve overt bodily motions are not publicly observable. Actions involving bodily motions, well, the motions themselves are observable, but why we're doing what we're doing, again, involves reasons that are not publicly observable. So greeting a friend, like I raised my hand. What am I doing? Am I greeting a friend? Or am I signaling a left turn? depends on the context, and it also depends on what's going on in here. So only one and two, um, physiological reactions and responses and bodily movements, count as publicly observable behavior to the behaviorist. Behavior in this sense, that is in the sense of one and two, does not enjoy the kind of privileged access granted to the first person in the Cartesian picture. That is, equal access for all is the essence of behavior as conceived by the behaviorist. Make sense? Awesome. Now we're going to get on to Hempel. Actually, I wonder how many of you had a chance to take a look at Hempel's paper? Usually I ask this at the beginning of the lecture, but I guess I neglected to today. Maybe nobody did. Oh, Grant did. Okay. So Hempel was a logical positivist. Logical positivism it was a sort of branch of analytic philosophy that emphasized, among other things, the verification principle of meaning, which we'll look at um, early. This was kind of an attempt to make philosophy as scientific as possible. But one of the interesting things about it is that it occurred before the idea of falsification really took off. Nowadays, in the sciences, we don't actually try and verify, we try and falsify our hypotheses. But the positivists were about verification. And basically, um, um, what it means is that uh, any proposition that you can express um, has to be verifiable, intersubjectively verifiable. Like a proposition like it is sunny today. Okay, we can check and see whether that's true or not. We just go out and look, verify. Yep, it's sunny. So that's intersubjectively verifiable, right? Um, Here's what Hempel said about psychological statements. He said, "We see clearly that the meaning of a psychological statement consists solely in the function of abbreviating the description of certain modes of physical response characteristics of the bodies of men and animals." So, what psychological statements for Hempel ultimately boil down to are um, behaviors. Remember, this is a philosophical or logical behaviorism, also known as analytical behaviorism, where behavior is constitutive of mentality. What is it to say that somebody is in pain? It's not some inner experience in your stream of consciousness. It's pain behavior. Ouch, crying ouch, withdrawing from the painful stimulus, right? And why? Well, because our private states are not intersubjectively verifiable. Like if I've stubbed my toe and I grab my foot and hop up and down on one leg going, ouch, I can say like, oh, looks like Josh is in pain. See, because look at that pain behavior. If I just say, ouch, oh, that hurts, there's a pain in my toe, that's a verbal report of something that is not intersubjectively verifiable, right? So that's logical behaviorism or philosophical behaviorism. It emphasizes the logical connections between psychological expressions and expressions about behavior. And the idea is that um, here we see on the first formulation of logical behaviorism in Kim on page 68. Any meaningful psychological statement, so a statement that's about mental phenomena of some kind, so like a description of a mental phenomenon, like pain or itch or a judgment, a cognition, an emotion, whatever, can be translated without a loss of any content into a cluster of statements that are solely about behavioral and physical phenomena. That's the idea. So, um, something like "I'm in pain" can be translated into a statement or a series of statements about behavior. That is what's being said in logical behaviorism 1. But we can broaden this out a bit, and that's what Kim does in logical behaviorism 2. Every meaningful psychologically expression can be defined solely in terms of behavioral and physical expressions. That is, expressions referring to behavioral and physical phenomena. So this is his line of thinking, as summarized by Kim. The meaning of a sentence, firstly, is given by the conditions that must be verified to obtain if the sentence is true. We may call these verification conditions. And again, this is the verification principle of meaning. Think again of the example I just used. It is sunny outside. Is that true? What conditions need to be verified? So we need certain conditions to obtain. We need for it to actually be sunny, for the sun to actually be shining. And that is public. It's intersubjectively verifiable. Anybody in my immediate vicinity can just go and look out the window and verify that those conditions, namely that the sun is shining, that those conditions have obtained, that they have happened, they have occurred. So, just broadly, fundamentally, the meaning of any sentence is given by these verification conditions that are publicly accessible. If a sentence, number two, if a sentence has a meaning that can be shared by different speakers, its verification conditions must be accessible to each speaker. They must be publicly accessible. And that gets us to three. Only behavioral and physical phenomena are publicly observable. Mental states are not publicly observable. Only behavior is publicly observable. So the only sentences about the mind that can mean anything are those that are at least translated or given as statements about publicly observable behavior. That's in short number four. The shareable meaning of any psychological sentence must be specifiable by statements of publicly observable behavior, publicly observable verification conditions. That is, statements describing behavioral and physical conditions that must hold if the psychological statement is true. Okay, I know I've thrown a lot at you there. So are there any questions about any of this? While I straighten my headphones out here because my hair is going all over the place. I mean, this is a pretty wordy roundabout way of saying that what really matters when it comes to knowing what is true is that things be publicly observable and intersubjectively verifiable. And so when we're talking about the mind, the only thing there that's intersubjectively verifiable is observable behavior, not inner mental states, which are private, like the contents of the theater are private, or the Beatles in our Beatle boxes are private. Okay, yeah. So the meaning of a sentence is given by the conditions that must be verified to obtain if the sentence is true. The meaning of the sentence, "it is sunny outside," is given by those conditions. The sun has to actually be shining. It has to be daytime. There have to be no clouds blocking out the sun. No, like, I don't know, for those who like classic episodes of The Simpsons, right? Um, Mr. Burns cannot have built a giant sun blocking device to block out the sun from Springfield, right? So these are conditions that need to obtain. Um, Daytime, no cloud cover, no evil billionaire blocking the sun for financial gain. Um, all of these conditions must obtain for that sentence, "it is sunny outside," to be true. Now, that sentence, "it is sunny outside," this gets us to number two. If it has meaning that can be shared by different speakers, if you and I can both know what it means to say "it is sunny outside," and if we are to know whether or not that sentence is true, that is whether it describes the way the world is at the present time. Its verification conditions have to be accessible to each speaker. That is publicly observable. So for you and I to know what "it is sunny outside" means, for you and I to know whether it is sunny outside, those conditions we talked about in part one, daytime, no cloud cover, etc. They all have to be publicly observable verification conditions. And it turns out in this example they are. I can go outside and look and see whether there is any cloud cover. I can look at the clock. Oh, it's about 3:30 p.m. In this time zone at this latitude, the sun should be out. It should be daylight, unless the sun is being blocked by something, right? So those verification conditions are publicly observable. Now, for number three, we're getting back to the mental. Only behavioral and physical phenomena, including physiological occurrences, are publicly observable. So, as with the verification conditions for the sentence "it is sunny outside," the conditions that must be verified to obtain when it comes to anything mental are really just behavioral and physical phenomena. Mental phenomena, again, are not publicly observable, but behavior is. Therefore, and this is the conclusion, the shareable meaning of any psychological sentence must be specifiable by statements of publicly observable verification conditions. That is, statements describing behavioral and physical conditions that must hold true if the statement is true. So, it is sunny outside. Say I adopt the attitude of belief toward that proposition. I believe it's sunny outside. I've checked the weather report. I've looked outside. What are some behavioral verification conditions that we could look to, such that we could be sure that I believe it is sunny? Well, maybe before I leave, I put sunscreen on. I put my sunglasses on. I put my hat on, right? Like, because you can't look in here and go, oh yeah, there's the belief. Josh has the belief that it's sunny. I can see inside of his mental theater and I can see the belief. No, we can't do that. So what do we have to go on? Behavior. What sort of behavioral conditions would obtain if Josh believes it's sunny outside? Well, maybe he'd put on sunscreen and wear sunglasses. Make sense? Awesome. How are we doing so far? Do we want a break soon? Are those Tristan and Shannon, are those yeses for break or for understanding? Okay, yeah. Maybe we'll take a couple smaller breaks. Um, like we'll kind of punctuate. Okay, good. I'm glad you understand. But maybe we'll take like some smaller breaks rather than one long brain break. We can punctuate it with smaller breaks if that sounds good to you guys. So let's see. I have 3:34 on the microwave. Oh goodness, all of these are different times, but I have 3:34 on my microwave clock. So why don't we take 5? Let's take 10. Let's come back at 3:44. How's that sound? All right. I'll pause the recording and I'll see you in 10 minutes. All right. All right. We're back. Boy, I'm getting hungry. Which I guess you could only infer from my observable behavior. Ah, what's going on here? Eh, how do I move this over? There we go. Okay. Sorry, I don't think you can see what I'm trying to move around on my screen, but I'm trying to move the little thingy that has all of your faces and my face, the camera view. I'm trying to move it out of my way. Um, Okay, Golden. If a lie is believed by everyone, then does it become true? Let's say everyone was mind controlled into thinking the sun was out and exhibits the proper behavior, even though objectively there was no sun. No, then everybody would just have a false belief because the verification conditions for the sentence that the sun is shining are publicly observable. Um, we could all be deceived about the sun, not shining when in fact it is shining, but that wouldn't make it true, right? What is true in philosophy is what is the case. So what is actually happening in the world? That is what is true, right? And we can have true beliefs and false beliefs. So in this case, if the sun is actually shining, it's not a matter of whether people believe the proposition the sun is shining. It's a matter of whether the sun is actually shining. Um, so if those verification conditions have obtained, the proposition is true. If the state of affairs, if that is the actual state of affairs, then beyond just the proposition that expresses the state of affairs, it is just true that the sun is shining, right? So where did we leave off? We were talking about um, these um, this sort of line of thinking of Hempel that Kim gives us on page 69, right? We were talking verification conditions. Everything's got the verification principle of meaning. The verification conditions have to be publicly accessible. Only behavioral and physical phenomena are publicly accessible. So the shareable meaning of any psychological statement has got to be specifiable in terms of these intersubjectively verifiable conditions, verification conditions. And Kim continues, and if anyone insists that there are intersubjective criteria for psychological expressions as well, so like I'm in pain, I'm hungry, etc., we should reply as the behaviorists would, that even if such existed, they, like Wittgenstein's beetles, could not be part of the meanings that can be understood and shared by different persons. Summarizing all this, we could say, insofar as psychological expressions have interpersonal meanings, they must be definable in terms of behavioral and physical expressions. So, the data that the behaviorist psychologist or the philosophical behaviorist are interested in have to be objective, intersubjectively verifiable data. Mental states are subjective and not intersubjectively verifiable. That's the whole point of the beetle in the box. So, is it possible to translate the subjective into the objective in the way that Hempel wants? Well, let's see. This is the example he uses. How could we translate the sentence, Paul has a toothache, which refers to a subjective experience of pain in the tooth? Well, maybe we could translate that into the following um, behavioral and physical expressions. First one, Paul weeps and make gestures of such and such kinds, like, oh, my tooth hurts, right? We ask Paul, what's the matter? And Paul says, I have a toothache. Paul goes to the dentist, and closer examination reveals that he's got a decayed tooth with exposed pulp. So, Paul's got a cavity, basically. Maybe we take some other physiological measurements and we see that Paul's blood pressure and his digestive processes, his reaction time, etc., show such and such changes, or such and such differences from people who are not in pain, such that we could infer that Paul seems to be in pain, right? Maybe even further, such and such processes occur in Paul's central nervous system. Maybe Paul's like C fibers are firing, right? These are a special type of nerve cell with these unmyelinated axons, and they fire when we experience pain. So maybe Paul's C fibers are firing, right? So that and this is not an exhaustive list. Maybe we could go on, right? Which of these is translatable? Only two. Why only two? Well, Paul weeps and makes gestures of such and such kinds, like like that. You ask Paul, "What's the matter?" Paul says, "I have a toothache." These are translatable. The others are not. Why not? Anyone want to take a stab at why C, D, and E are not are not really good translations of the sentence Paul has a toothache? I'll just wait a couple seconds before I tell you. Well, they are observable. I can observe Paul's tooth. Maybe I'm Paul's dentist and I can see, you've got a cavity. He might not feel pain even if these things are true. Yeah, but that's possible. He might not feel the decaying tooth. Yeah, I once had a tooth that was like pretty bad. It was a wisdom tooth back here, and it really needed to come out, but it wasn't causing significant pain, which was weird because it had like come out, but it had a cavity, right? Some people might not feel pain. Yeah, I mean, basically, C, D, and E don't really have anything to do with behavior. That's in a nutshell. Someone had their hand up too. Did you want to go? Sorry, I didn't see who it was who had their hand up, but
It was me. I'm all good.
oh, okay, okay. But yeah, some of you, you're right in these observations, right? Closer examination reveals a decayed tooth with exposed pulp, but that might not actually be causing Paul pain. Um, Paul might also, it's also possible that Paul could be feeling pain without having a decayed tooth with exposed pulp, in a similar way to how some people who are missing limbs experience phantom pain in those limbs, right? Likewise with his blood pressure, digestive processes, reaction times, he might have changes in blood pressure, etc., and not have pain. He might have pain and not have these physiological changes. Same with the changes in his central nervous system. Well, if he said he was in pain and we did find his tooth was exposed, great. But a decayed tooth with exposed pulp isn't behavior. It is physiological, but it's not behavioral. Here would we would really be going with well, if he shows us, then we'd be going with something like B. Right. What's the matter? Look at my tooth. And I can see in there, and I can see he's got a tooth that's decaying and has exposed pulp. Right. But maybe even B, whether it's like the example we kind of turned it into there, where Paul says, "Look, this is what is the matter. I have a toothache, and you can see my tooth is all messed up." Maybe that's not even translatable because it concerns verbal behavior. Like whether Paul says, "I have a toothache," or whether he says, "I have a toothache, look at my tooth," it's not translatable into Paul has a toothache because the kind of behavior we're talking about concerns verbal behavior. Why wouldn't verbal behavior be translatable in the way that we want it? It's got something to do with something I mentioned before our break. I'm reporting a mental state.
He could just lie or not actually know.
Well, he could be lying, or he could,
Like he doesn't know his exact mental state.
yeah, he might not have perfect introspective access to his own mental states. But the main reason is that um, the verbal behavior is a report of something subjective. Um, so it kind of falls back on this mental state um, in a way that A doesn't. So it's a bit like the beetle in the box. It's like if you asked me, it's like if I said, I have a beetle in my box. Okay, cool. But I don't know what your beetle looks like compared to my beetle. I have your verbal report that there is a beetle in the box. But when I think of beetle, I think of, I don't know, a rhinoceros beetle. But when you say beetle, you're talking about a Volkswagen beetle, right? And we wouldn't know. We wouldn't know the difference because we still got this sort of private mental thing that we fall back on. Um, so we don't really have the intersubjective verifiability that we want. So based on Paul's verbal behavior. So the only thing we can really rely on are his winces and groans and his gestures of such and such a kind. Make sense? Let's dive into this a little deeper and look at difficulties with behavioral definitions. So let's consider certain mentalistic terms. A big one is belief. Beliefs and desires are the big ones that you'll often hear talked about. These are propositional attitudes. We looked at this when we covered chapter 1. What are propositional attitudes? They're attitudes like belief, like desire, that we take toward propositions. Propositions are sentences about the world that can be true or false. And we can express propositional attitudes propositionally, and these sentences will usually feature a that clause. So Josh believes that the sun is shining. That is a statement that captures this propositional attitude that I have, an attitude of belief toward the proposition or about the proposition, it is sunny or the sun is shining. Now, Kim asks here, how could we define beliefs in terms of behavior? Because that's what the behaviorists want. We want our mental, our statements, our sort of mentalistic propositions to be translatable into propositions about behavior. So how could we do that? Let's take, for example, a belief. There are no native leopards in North America. So we've got somebody, S, believes that there are no native leopards in North America. How could we define that in terms of S's behavior? Maybe it's a little easier with Paul and his toothache because Paul is in pain. And although pain is a sort of private, subjective mental state, it is associated with pain behavior. Pain behavior of the type that we see in A, where Paul weeps and makes gestures and such a kind, like winces and groans. But how can we do that with something like belief or desire? So Paul is in pain. Okay, Paul has a toothache. I can translate that without loss of meaning into a behavioral statement like Paul weeps and winces and groans, etc. How do I do that with a belief like there are no native leopards in North America? They don't seem to be translatable or explainable in terms of A. Shannon, that's good. She doesn't bring leopard spray with her because she does not believe there are native leopards. Yeah, perhaps. Perhaps. And yeah, maybe that's a possibility. But we'll see why it doesn't exactly work. Although that is a really good example. Did you know that this is completely off topic, but did you know that large cats find the spray of I believe it's Calvin Klein, uh, attractive? So, scientists who study big cats, like say tigers in like India, might use Calvin Klein to attract tigers to their camera stations to observe the tigers. And although we don't have native leopards in North America, we do have mountain lions. So if you're in an area where there are mountain lions, maybe you and you believe there are mountain lions there, you might desire not to wear certain sorts of fragrances lest you attract the mountain lions. Just some food for thought. Yeah. Is not doing something a behavior? Yes, I could say that could be a type of behavior, like type number 4. Actions not involving overt bodily motions. Like maybe it's winter time. Let me set the stage. It's winter time. Uh, it snows. And you think, well, maybe I've got to plow the driveway. But I checked the weather. No, it's actually going to get really warm later today. I'm not going to shovel the driveway because the sun will come out and melt the snow. That's kind of behavior. Okay, so how can we translate or explain beliefs in terms of A? Well, we can't really. Um, like in Simon Says, like if I do something but Simon didn't say to do it, or Simon says to do something and I fail to do it, yeah, I guess that's a kind of behavior. Again, like perhaps number 3 or number 4 from earlier in the slides. So, okay, we can't pain behavior we can translate, but beliefs we can't really translate in terms of A. We've got to go with B, translate in terms of verbal behavior. And Kim says here, a person who believes that there are no native leopards in North America has a certain linguistic disposition. For example, he would tend to utter the sentence, there are no native leopards in North America, or its synonymous variants under certain conditions. So, for example, if you asked S, hey, do you believe there are any native leopards in North America? S would say, no, I don't think there are any native leopards in North America, or something similar, right? He he wouldn't he wouldn't wince or groan or behave like in A, like, hey, do you believe there are leopards? Well, he wouldn't really do that, right? He would report his belief verbally. So this leads to a schematic definition, and this is a little technical, so we'll go through it slowly. A schematic definition where S believes that P, such that if S is asked, is it true that P, S will answer, yes, it is true that P. So S has a disposition, if you like, to produce the appropriate sort of verbal behavior under certain specified conditions. So if S does not believe there are any native leopards in North America, then when you ask him, he'll say, I don't believe it is true that there are native leopards in North America. Or if you ask him, are there native mountain lions in North America? S will say, yes, it is true that there are native mountain lions in North America, or some equivalent, right? So I just want to make sure this is like a sort of dispositional sort of definition, right? S believes that P, and this def stands for definiens. It means that under certain conditions, namely being asked whether S believes P, S will answer, yes, I believe P, or the equivalent. And S and P are our little variables, right? S is our subject, could be any subject. P is the belief, could be any belief. Is it true that P? Could be. Is it true that there are native leopards in North America? Is it true that bananas are yellow? Is it true that the sun is shining? Etc. It can mean whatever we want it to mean. What if he lies because he's embarrassed that he's wrong or something similar? We're going to get there. We're going to get there. I'm glad you're thinking along those lines, Matthew. This has something to do with the defeasibility of, I think, mental behavioral entailments. We're going to get there, though. Shannon, go ahead.
I just have a question about like why is verbal behavior treated so differently in this? Like I can trust that the person's actions to show that they're in pain are true, and but I can't trust that their words are.
Um, well, this is a tricky one to answer. Uh, but I think it's got to do with like a sort of assumption that people are rational. And I know like you're going to say, well, they're not. And sure, yeah, people are not always rational. But assuming all things being equal and people are behaving rationally, they will report the truth, right? It is an assumption. It is an assumption that's being made. Of course, a psychologist would come along and say people might not be being rational. People have cognitive biases. People might deceive themselves or deceive others. So where philosophers tend to look at the human being as the being with reason, an animal with reason, maybe a psychologist would say, no, 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 we're not that rational. But that is an assumption that we're making that S is a rational individual who's going to accurately report what they believe. So why is this? Oh, I see. Okay, yeah. Uh, Another assumption. So, like it says at the bottom, we assume S wants to tell the truth. Um, and we assume verbal behavior is produced by a complex of mental states, and that those mental states are accurately representing are accurate representations of the way the world is. Um, we also assume that S is a skilled language user, and I'd also add that we're speaking in the same language, right? Like if like, hey, S, do you believe that P? Well, if our subject doesn't speak English, they're not going to be able to answer. Or if I ask like I got like this little nephew guy who's like 4 years old, and I can ask him, "Do you believe there are native leopards in North America?" And he's going to say, "What? What's a leopard?" Right? Um, uh, so I'm assuming that like we've got rational individuals with beliefs that are veridical, with true beliefs, uh, that they're competent speakers of English, right? There's a lot of assumptions going on here, but all things being equal, this brings us to what we call the desire, belief, action principle. Um, so, um, if a person desires that P and believes that doing A is an optimal way to secure uh, that P, she will do A. Or maybe, yeah, he might. He might. Um, so, if a person desires to honestly report their beliefs and believes that making a certain utterance is an optimal way to do that, she will do that. Like in the case of our subject, right? Here we're talking about beliefs, but beliefs interact with desires, um, such that we get these sort of complex chains of beliefs and desires and actions. Um, Mary in the book, Mary is the example. Mary is warm. She's hot. It's too hot in her apartment, and she desires not to be hot. And she believes that opening the window to let in some air is an optimal way of not being so warm anymore. Then she will get up and open the window, right? What are some other ones? Some beliefs, desire, action chains that we can come up with. It could be as simple as making a sandwich, okay? Um, I'm hungry. I will go get a snack. Yes. If you desire food and you believe there's food to eat in the kitchen, exactly. Like, I'm hungry. I would like to not be hungry. So there's my desire. I desire that P. P is to not be hungry, to be satisfied, to be full. I believe there's some ingredients to make a delicious sandwich in the fridge. So I get up and I make a sandwich and I eat it. So if I desire not to be hungry and I believe that making a sandwich is an optimal way of securing P, not being hungry, then I will do that. I will make a sandwich and eat it, right? Okay. But there's a thing, there's something else we got to consider here. The defeasibility of mental behavioral entailments. Now, Kim writes, if there is a plausible entailment of behavior B by mental states M1, M2, Mn, there is always a further mental state Mn plus 1 such that M1, et cetera, and Mn plus 1 together plausibly entail not B. What a mouthful, huh? Can we make sense of this? Well, do you remember the rest of Mary, the example concerning Mary in the book, opening the window? I guess this is my way of testing who's done the readings. But do you remember? Mary, it's hot in Mary's apartment. Mary desires not to be so hot. She believes that opening the window could cool the place down a bit. So she could open the window. But why might she not open the window? Yeah, there's noise. Maybe it'll let the rain in. Maybe it's really noisy. She won't be able to study, or it'll disturb her grandma who's sleeping in the next room. So that's what this is about. It's saying that even if there's a combination of mental states like beliefs and desires that plausibly entail a certain behavior, there's always another mental state that could entail not doing that behavior. And this is to say that the mind to behavior connections are always defeasible by the occurrence of another mental state. Defeasibility here means can be overturned or canceled out. So Mary believes that it's hot and desires to open the window, desires to not be hot, and believes that opening the window will help cool down her apartment. She could open the window, but she also believes that there's a jackhammer out there that's really noisy and that might disturb her grandma. And she doesn't want to disturb her grandma, so she does not open the window. So the behavior, opening the window, is defeasible by the occurrence of another mental state, the belief that it's noisy and the desire not to disturb her grandmother who's having a nap, right? So there's a lot of different examples which sort of highlight the defeasibility of mental behavioral entailments. Um, yeah, so being embarrassed about your belief would be defeasibility of the action of agreeing that there are no leopards in North America. Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not sure why you'd be embarrassed about not believing there are no native leopards, but there might be some reason why you don't utter uh, a sentence that expresses your belief, right? So here's kind of the point, right? Um, Considerations like these, Kim writes on 75 and 76, make it seem exceedingly unlikely that anyone could ever produce correct behavioral definitions of mental terms linking every mental expression with an equivalent behavioral expression referring solely to pure physical behavior, the motions and noises. To have even a glimmer of success, we would need, it seems, to work at the level of intentional action, not of physical behavior. That is, at the level of actions like greeting a friend, buying and selling, reading the morning paper, not behavior at the level of motions and noises. Right. Replace leopards with something like thinking there are 13 months in the year, and after saying this, you die on the hill. Uh, well, okay, but okay, so somebody might ask, do you believe there are 13 months in the year? And maybe somebody believes that there are, but doesn't say that because they're embarrassed about possibly being wrong. Is that what's happening here? Yeah, I suppose. Like, there are 12. Maybe, yeah, like maybe you're a contrarian, right? And you just like arguing for the sake of arguing. And you want to argue, actually, I think there should be 13 months, even though there are 12. And the reason why you make that utterance is because of some mental state, where you should have said I believe there are 12. You just say, yes, I do believe there are 12, but I like arguing for the sake of arguing. That would be like a mental state that defeats the entailment of, making the correct utterance, which is that there are 12 months out of the year, right? Um, okay, so the point of this is that if we want to translate verbal behavior is not translatable in the way that we want, because there's always a potential mental defeater for whatever we did or didn't do, whatever behaviors we did or didn't do. We can always appeal to another mental state to try and explain why somebody did behavior B or not B. So to make sense of behavior, verbal behavior, but other behavior, Kim is saying we have to work at the level of intentional action, not physical behavior. We have to appeal to mental states to make sense of what people do and say. We can't get away from it in the way that Hempel wants. Does that make sense? Okay, I think nobody's raising their hand, so it sounds like maybe we're all good. But just to reiterate, right? If you are kind of not sure, I know I'm throwing a lot at you very quickly here. If you're not sure about what's going on, don't be afraid to stop me. All right, let's look at pain. Let's get away from verbal behavior and get back to pain. So, just to be clear, we all understand why verbal behavior, like behavior of type B, verbal behavior, is not the same as behavior of type A, motions and noises, right? Verbal behavior is a report of, we want to translate things like Josh believes that there are no leopards in North America, no native leopards, or Paul has a toothache. We want those to be translatable into verbal behavior, but we can't do that because of the defeasibility of mental behavioral entailments. There's always another potential defeater, another potential belief or desire or some other mental state that might cause us to not be when we might otherwise be, or to be when we might have otherwise not beed. Just somebody tell me, are we good? Are we good?
Yeah, yes.
I'll try and dumb it down.
Thank you.
Okay, so well, again, like Mary, right? Mary's window is physical behavior, but verbal behavior. A true belief. Here's a true belief. The Earth is a sphere. I'm going to pick on the flat earthers, okay? Because easy target. Um, it's a true proposition. The Earth is a sphere. Is a true proposition. So that sentence says something about the world. It says that the planet Earth is spherical, which is true, right? So you might ask somebody, "Hey, do you believe that the Earth is a sphere?" Maybe just by chance I've happened upon a flat earther in my lecture. I'm like, "Okay, you believe the Earth is a sphere, correct?" Unbeknownst to me, I've pointed to a flat earther who believes that the Earth is not a sphere. But because they're in a room full of students who will laugh at them for believing the earth is flat, and they desire not to be laughed at, they don't report what they actually believe. Instead of saying, no, I do not believe the Earth is a sphere, they say, yes, the Earth is a sphere, even though they believe it's not a sphere. And it's a desire not to be embarrassed that's caused them to answer in a way that doesn't reflect what they actually believe. Is that clear? Okay. When you said dumb it down, I was like, flat earthers. Okay. Um, right. Do intent? Yes, yes, they do. They do. Intentional actions are defeasible. Um, or I would say the mental states that cause our actions are defeasible. That's what the example of Mary shows, right? Mary believes it is really hot in her apartment. She desires that it is not so hot and believes that opening the window could do that. So she could open the window, but she also believes that there's a jackhammer making a lot of noise and that could wake up her grandmother. And she desires not to disturb her grandmother. So now, where she was about to open the window, she says, actually, wait a sec. I'm not going to open the window. See? See how that works? So we've been so all this is to say that when it comes to verbal behavior and other types of intentional behavior, we've got to work at that level of intentional action where we look at people as agents who act on the basis of reasons. Here, those reasons are beliefs and desires. Um, those agents, the minds of the agents are like the ultimate source of those actions, right? So why did I make a sandwich? I was hungry and I believed there were ingredients in the fridge. I desired not to be hungry, so I got up and made a sandwich. It all starts with mental states. And we can't really translate those into the sorts of behavioral descriptions we want to because they're always defeasible by the addition of another mental state, another belief or desire. Like, oh, I've got some ham in the fridge. I'll make a sandwich. Oh, wait a minute. That ham expired last week and I forgot to throw it out. All right. No sandwich for me, right? But now we want to get back to the level of motions and noises, right? Natural expressions in behavior. The winces and groans, the motions and noises. Like when Paul has a toothache, we translate that into like Paul weeps and makes gestures of such and such a kind. Um, do those do pains does the mental state of experiencing pain entail those certain pain behaviors like the winces and groans? Well, first let's be clear on what we mean by entailment. Kim says, what does entailment mean in this context? When we say that pain entails winces and groans, we are saying that anyone in pain winces and groans is analytically or conceptually true. That is, like the statement, bachelors are unmarried and vixens are females, it is true solely in virtue of the meanings of the terms involved. So it's analytically or conceptually true because that's just what the words mean, right? So um, it's analytically true that all bachelors are unmarried because definitionally, a bachelor is an unmarried man. You can survey folks around the world, and you will not find a married bachelor because that's not what it means to be a bachelor. That's not what the word means. Vixens are females. Specifically, they're female foxes, right? You can look at all of the, any female fox, scientifically speaking, is a vixen. You won't find a male vixen. Um, so these are like analytically true, conceptually true in the sense that it's definitionally true that bachelors are unmarried. You're not going to find an unmarried bachelor because then they just wouldn't be a bachelor, right? So the argument here is that there is no possible world in which a being that winces and groans is not in pain, Or the converse, if any creature is in pain, it necessarily winces and groans, because just like um, being a bachelor logically entails being unmarried, here the claim is pain entails pain behavior. So pain, if you're in pain, you must wince and groan. There's no possible world in which there's a creature in pain that doesn't wince and groan. Now, I think you can kind of get a sense of the problem that we're about to run into here, right? There could be, for example, super Spartans and super Stoics. Tell me about the Spartans and the Stoics. Who knows about them? The Spartans first. Tell me about the Spartans. Maybe you know about this guy. Who's this? Of course, he's a fictional Spartan. Yeah, that's Kratos. He came from Sparta and now he lives in Old Norse world or wherever. Midgard. Now he's in Midgard with his son. He was a Spartan warrior, though, right? So maybe there are these super Spartans that never feel pain. Or if they have pain, they don't show it. So these would be people who never exhibit pain behavior, even if they are in pain. Of course, I would say Kratos, he seems pretty good about physical pain, but he certainly seems to experience emotional pain. He worries about his son. He misses his wife. Um, he worries about the family back in Sparta that he's responsible for killing, right? Sorry if I'm spoiling any God of War stuff for you. Um, but Kratos, at least as far as physical pain goes, he doesn't really seem to show much pain behavior, does he? Even if he experiences pain, or the 300 Spartans from that movie 300, right, where they're all like shiny and muscly, and they don't seem to exhibit pain behavior very much. Even though I'm sure if they get hit with some of those arrows from the Persian army, it probably hurts, but they don't exhibit pain, right? Those are super Spartans. What about super Stoics? What is a Stoic? Tell me about the Stoics. Anyone know about the Stoics? Well, not somebody who doesn't care about anything necessarily. Um, Marcus Aurelius was a Stoic. Yep. Um, I don't think they'd be like a zombie, Grant. Zombies wouldn't have any pain at all. In fact, it would be the opposite for zombies. Philosophical zombies might have pain behavior, but no pain. But super Spartans and super Stoics would have pain, but no pain behavior.
They don't show their emotion, the
Yeah,
Stoics.
yeah. Stoics try and live a life of virtue according to reason, which in some cases involves moderating your emotions. You know how some people get mad about every little thing they read in the news? Well, a Stoic might say, well, that's unfortunate, but there isn't really anything I can do about that, so I won't be mad about it. Or, yeah, I'm in pain, but what are you going to do about it? Soon I will heal, and then I won't be in pain. So there could be super Stoics, like the super Spartans, who might experience pain but not exhibit pain behavior. Does that mean that uh, pain entails or does not entail pain behavior? Well, we could say again that even if we have these super Spartans and super Stoics, we could say that they have a disposition or a propensity to behave in a painy way when the right conditions obtain. I think the example that Kim uses is like, okay, maybe we've got super Spartans. If to be in pain is to exhibit pain behavior, but these super Spartans never do that, then okay, they don't experience pain. Well, no, they might have a disposition to do so. Maybe you get Kratos really drunk, and he starts going on about all this pain that he's in, emotional and physical pain, right? Um, so there are conditions that might obtain where a super Spartan or a super Stoic would exhibit pain behavior. And it would also be strange to say that uh, they aren't experiencing pain just because there is an absence of pain behavior. There are also non-human animals that might lack the sorts of mental states uh, and also the physiology that we have, um, through which we express, or by virtue of which we express our pain behavior. So if the claim is that um, pain entails pain behavior and that behavior is winces and groans, then that seems to deny that a creature could be in pain because it lacks vocal cords or because it has a very different physiology than we do. After all, I think we all agree that non-human animals can experience pain, correct? Like, let's go through some examples. Do you think dogs and cats can experience pain? But dogs and cats have vocal cords. If a dog or a cat is in pain, it might whimper or meow, right? Um, what about an octopus? Do you think an octopus can experience pain? Oh, I'm sorry, Grant. Like she hurt? Okay, I'm glad. Ah, yeah, I know a cat like that. Yeah, like Golden, you're right. Like an octopus, I think we would all countenance the idea that an octopus can experience pain, but we know that an octopus is not going to go ouch, right? Because it doesn't have vocal cords. Its pain behavior is going to be different. So this shows that there's no specific behavior entailed by pain. Different creatures will have different pain behaviors. Maybe Paul with his toothache goes, ouch. Octopus don't have teeth, but maybe an octopus that's missing a limb would move around and change its chromatophores and spray ink in such and such a way. And that's octopus pain behavior. So the pain entailment thesis seems to be wrong, right? So this leaves us with a sort of weak behavior entailment thesis, which says for any pain-capable species, there is a certain behavior type B, such that for that species, being in pain entails a propensity to emit behavior of type P, of type B. And this makes defining pain in terms of pain behavior impossible because every different kind of creature is going to have a different propensity for a different sort of behavior. Make sense? Right? Like Paul's going to go, my dog's going to go, arf. My cat might go, wow. An octopus might change color real fast and swim away from the painful stimulus, right? Okay. Before we get to ontological behaviorism, do we want to have another quick brain break? Well, so we're talking about we've dealt with intentional actions, but now we're talking about um, pain behavior of type A, and we were looking at the thesis that pain analytically or conceptually entails pain behavior in the same way that being a bachelor entails being unmarried. And we've seen that this is not the case. The closest we can get is sort of like a weak entailment between pain and pain behavior, which means that we can't really define pain in terms of behavior because the variety of pain behavior across species is just so varied that we can't come up with a sort of conceptual or analytical definition of pain in terms of pain behavior. Tristan wants to keep going, but I kind of want a 5 minute break. And so that is what we will do. Well, it's 5 minutes. I'll come back. I have 4:35 on the microwave. I'll come back at 4:40. And then we'll try and finish off these slides. Okay. See you all in a moment. Just share my screen. All right. So thanks for bearing with me. Sometimes I just need 5 minutes because I love this class. Uh, Going for 3 hours is a bit of a mental marathon. So sometimes you just got to kind of step away for a bit. Okay, we've talked about why um, pain does not entail specific pain behavior. We'll also come back to this when we talk about identity theory and functionalism. So this is something that we'll revisit, pain and pain behavior and the neural substrates of pain. So we will kind of revisit this as we move forward in the course. But let's leave it behind for now and talk about ontological behaviorism. We've been talking about logical behaviorism. Remember, this is what deals with what we can say meaningfully about mentality and behavior. What the logical behaviorists want is to show that um, behavior is constitutive of mentality, and what we've seen by looking at pain and pain behavior. Um, and about the defeasibility of mental behavioral entailments and all of that shows that we probably can't really get there. Ontological behaviorism makes claims about what is and what is not. Ontology is the study of being, which can be taken to mean the study of like capital B, being, or the study of beings, including their mentality and their behavior. So, ontological behaviorism makes claims about this. About the ontology of mentality and of behaviors and stuff. An ontological behaviorist would say there are no inner states, or perhaps claim that inner states play no important role in the production of behavior. And this is a kind of eliminativism about the mental. I mean, just consider these two claims to illustrate the difference. Claim number one says pain is winces and groans, and claim number two says pain is the cause of winces and groans. Well, number one is ontological behaviorism. Pain just is winces and groans. Pain just is pain behavior, and there's nothing else to it. It's making an ontological claim about the nature of pain. It's saying that this mental state is really just a behavior. Pain is the cause of winces and groans is a logical behaviorist statement. Now, logical behaviorism does not entail ontological behaviorism. Why? Do we want to discuss? Well, logical behaviorism allows for there to be mental states that cause certain behaviors, and it wants those it wants sentences like mentalistic sentences to be translatable into sentences about behavior, but it doesn't claim that there are no mental states. So logical behaviorism doesn't entail ontological behaviorism. Yeah, I mean, people can act, people can be mistaken, people can experience weird kind of phenomena like there's phantom pain, there's congenital analgesia, right? Um, Now, does ontological behaviorism entail logical behaviorism? The answer seems to be no. I actually would have to go back to the text on this one, which I will do now, just to make sure that uh, just to make sure that I get this right. Let's go to page. I think we're page. Oh, no, go away. All right. Here we go. Let's see what it says here. Well, actually, maybe this is getting too far into the weeds because we're going to talk about some of this when we look at Dennett toward the end of the class. Well, let's not get hung up on this. So, what is the relationship between pain and pain behavior? Well, actually, are there any questions before I get to this bit and then to the last bit, which is about behaviorist psychology? All right. Kim writes on page 80, if a person observes someone writhing on the floor, clutching his broken leg, and screaming for help, and yet refuses to acknowledge that he is in pain, wouldn't it be correct to say that this person does not have the concept of pain? That he does not know what pain means? If Wittgenstein's beetle in the box shows anything, it is the point that publicly accessible behaviors are essential to anchor the meanings of our mental terms, like pain, and explain the possibility of knowledge of what goes on in other people's minds. Wittgenstein might say, well, he would say, that what we're really doing here when we use these terms, pain, etc., is we're all playing the same language game. Um, and this is how not only Wittgenstein, but other philosophers too, like Descartes, have dealt with the problem of solipsism and the problem of other minds. Um, our our publicly accessible behaviors, including our verbal behaviors, but also behaviors of type A, are what help us uh, fix the meaning of these mentalistic terms. As Wittgenstein said, the meaning of a word is its use in the language game. And so, yeah, if you saw somebody writhing on the floor with a broken leg and refuse to acknowledge that he's in pain, either you're a sick son of a bitch or you don't have the concept of pain because you know uh, or you ought to know through observable behavior that this is pain behavior. So this is how Wittgenstein, again, and other philosophers kind of deal with the problem of other minds, the problem of solipsism. We fix the meaning of these mentalistic terms um, thanks to our behavior, our observable behavior, including our verbal behavior, how we play the language game, how we use the words. Make sense? Now, we've already got pretty into the weeds with Wittgenstein. Now I got to throw some Kripke at you. Um, I'm not an expert on Kripke, but I think this comes from Kripke's interpretation of Wittgenstein, which is called Kripkenstein. Um, so Kripke was another very influential analytic philosopher who we will re-encounter as we go through the course. But let's follow along with what Kim does with Kripke here. So let's consider the following. How long is 1 meter? Well, we define 1 meter by reference to the standard meter, which is a piece of, I forget what kind of metal it is. But it's some fancy piece of metal that's kept in a special vault in Paris, and that is the standard meter. And we could even utter a sentence like, the standard meter is 1 meter long. Now, is that statement necessarily true? In other words, is it conceptually or analytically true that the standard meter is 1 meter long? Well, no, it's not. We could have chosen something else to be the standard meter. And maybe that something else wouldn't have been 1 meter long. It's just a contingent fact that we've decided the length of a meter as 100 centimeters or 1,000 millimeters or the length of the standard meter. We could have picked something else and called it a meter. So it's not necessarily true that the standard meter is 1 meter long. Rather, it is contingently true. So the relationship between the standard meter and our concept of 1 meter long is a contingent relationship, not a necessary relationship. It's kind of like if I identified red by pointing at a red tomato. The tomato used to be green. Now it's red. I pointed at it now when it was red and I said, "That's red." Now I'm not observing that the tomato is red. I'm saying this color, this is the standard red tomato. This is the color red. Well, it used to be green, but now it's red. And from now on, this color and anything this color we define as tomato red, right? So we can use contingent facts to fix our concepts. The same might be true of pain and pain behavior, right? Kim writes, after all, in worlds in which different laws hold, or worlds in which the central nervous systems of humans and those of other organisms are hooked up differently to peripheral sensory surfaces and motor output systems, the patterns of causal relations involving pain may be very different. But as things stand in this world, pain is the cause of winces and groans and certain other behaviors in humans and related animal species. So again, there's no logical entailment between pain and pain behavior. Like, think about it this way. We can imagine a possible world where there are people and they experience pain, but when they experience pain, they don't make winces and groans. Instead, they flap their arms and go, right? And it's just a contingent fact that in this universe we go ouch and wince and groan, whereas these humans in the other possible world go when they're in pain. And in that world, it's a contingent relationship between pain and this behavior, just like in our world, there's a contingent relationship between pain and winces and groans or going ouch. So there's no logical or necessary entailment between pain and the specific type of pain behavior that humans exhibit in this world, because it is not true that in every possible world, pain behavior is the same. Okay, any questions before we talk about behaviorism and psychology? We've spent most of this lecture talking about logical behaviorism and a little ontological behaviorism, but how about behaviorist psychology? Any questions before we get to that? Well, if there are no questions, I'll carry on. So again, we've been focused on the philosophical side of things. What about the psychological side of things? One way you can think of behaviorist psychology is as a normative, like behaviorism and psychology is like a normative view of what psychologically ought to be concerned with. Um, so um, so what is normativity? Can anyone tell me what normativity is concerned with? Well, Whenever we're talking about something normative, we're dealing with an ought or a should, right? Normativity is all about oughts, as opposed to like descriptivity, which is about what is. Um, and so one way you can think about this is as an approach to psychology on which psychologists, yeah, exactly, like Cole says, a sort of dogma or let's say an opinion of how psychology should work as a field, right? So some behaviorists might say, okay, there might be mental states, but those aren't observable. So what we ought to do is focus on observable behavior rather than unobservable mental states. That's a normative claim. A second way to think of behaviorism is a little bit more radical. In fact, Kim calls it radical behaviorism. On radical behaviorism, like the style of behaviorism we see in B.F. Skinner, what we try to do is construct psychological theories that are grounded in conditioning, which, as I said toward the beginning of the lecture, is a view of learning as a matter of association and reinforcement. So classical conditioning in the sense of like Pavlov's dogs, or operant conditioning, like rats or pigeons in Skinner boxes, learning to push certain buttons to get a reward, right? Now, two is kind of beyond the scope of this class. We might talk about two in a philosophy of psychology class or a cognitive science class, but since this is a philosophy of mind class, we're going to be concerned with what is normative because philosophers are really interested in normativity. You know, one way to characterize philosophy, which we talked about before in one of our earlier lectures, is as a sort of endeavor where we try and ask and answer fundamental questions. But another way to think of philosophy is that philosophy is normative. Philosophy is concerned with oughts, whereas the sciences are concerned with ises, right? So, for example, uh, psychology is descriptive, so it's concerned with what is the case. A cognitive psychologist might ask, how do humans reason, right? Whereas a philosopher would tell you how you ought to reason. You ought to follow the rules of proper reasoning. You ought to try and avoid logical fallacies. Try and be aware of your cognitive biases. So a psychologist would say people reason like this. They have these biases. They follow the rules of proper reasoning in these conditions, but not these conditions. They describe how we actually think. Whereas a philosopher would says this is how you ought to think if you want to arrive at a correct conclusion. And so number one is concerned with normativity, which philosophers are really interested in. It's not, no, not exactly. It's just a claim about psychology. So we're dealing with mind, not with specific psychological paradigms. Um, Although free will is going to come up in a big way later in the course when we talk about mental causation. But yeah, I think Skinner would probably, I don't know his particular views, but I think that Skinner would deny that we have free will. Or at least he would say we don't have as much as we think we do. Watson probably would say the same thing. They would say that, like the American behaviorists, like John Watson, B.F. Skinner, they would say that if we could take babies and raise them and condition them just right to make doctors, scientists, janitors, car sales persons, and we could have a utopia by just conditioning all our children the right way. Um, no. First of all, that sounds very dystopic, and yeah, like like emotional eugenics. It's like we'll just take this baby and condition him to be a doctor. Well, no, okay. It turns out it doesn't work that way, um, because it's not all about nurture, right? Anyway, that's kind of beyond the scope of this class. So we're going to look at one, which is about normativity and what Kim calls methodological behaviorism. So here's a claim of methodological behaviorism. The only admissible evidence for the science of psychology is observable behavioral data. That is, data concerning the observable physical behavior of organisms. Again, this is normative because it's a claim concerning what psychologists ought to be looking at. Ought we use as data? Observable behavior. That is what we ought to use as data. That's what methodological behaviorism claims. Why insist on this? Well, it's got to do with this notion of intersubjective verifiability. And this was, even after the cognitive revolution, the idea of intersubjective verifiability remained very big, right? Things, in order to count as data for the psychologist, they have to be publicly observable and intersubjectively verifiable, not private, unobservable mental states that only the person that only one person has access to, right? Of course, different psychologists might disagree. In the 70s, we started seeing those mental rotation studies I talked about earlier, where verbal reports were considered data. Earlier, the psychophysicists considered verbal reports as data, like the relationship between sound pressure and volume. How do you work that out? Well, you've got to play some sounds and see how loud people think they are, right? Or James's introspection. James was all about introspecting, examining the contents of one's own stream of consciousness. Similar kind of to the phenomenologists like Edmund Husserl. Um, Edmund Husserl's doctoral advisor, by the way, was Franz Brentano, the intentionality guy, and Husserl was a phenomenologist. Phenomenology in this context is a sort of radical empiricism about the contents of one's own conscious mind, right? So these are all sort of branches of psychology or psychology adjacent branches of philosophy that say, we can have other things besides observable behavior as our data. But methodological behaviorists would say, no, we need to have publicly accessible, publicly observable, intersubjectively verifiable data because we want psychology to be an objective science, right? A stronger claim is psychological theories must not invoke the internal states of psychological subjects. That is, psychological explanations must not appeal to internal states of organisms, nor should references to such states occur in deriving predictions about behavior. So we should not invoke mental states at all, refer to them at all. It should all be about behavior, about conditioning, about stimulus, association, reinforcement, and response. So how do we do this? Well, Skinner thought, again, as I've said a number of times today, all learning was the product of conditioning. All learning is the product of association and reinforcement. And various behaviors that we exhibit can be explained by different histories of association and reinforcement. So maybe we learn pain behavior because of the association of a painful stimulus with certain behaviors, maybe that we observe and maybe that are reinforced by our caregivers. Like I stub my toe and I go, ouch. And my mom goes, there, little guy. And I saw that, oh, I got a reaction. My mom saw that I was in pain when I said ouch. So I stimulus, association, reinforcement. So that's what I do now when I stub my toe. I go ouch, right? And maybe that's what explains all learning. That's the claim of methodological behaviorism. But this leads Kim to ask, quote, if such an explanation works, isn't that because of the differences in the histories of the two organisms led to differences in their present internal states? Isn't it plausible to suppose that these differences here and now are what is directly implicated in the production of different behaviors now? Accepting something like Psychological theory one or two would be accepting mnemic causation. Kids are very much like that. If you ignore kids when they fall over, they just get back up most of the time. Yeah, but if you call them, they'll cry at everything. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, and I'm not saying that kids don't learn by association and reinforcement. They do, but the claim is that all learning is the product of association and reinforcement, and that is wrong. And this is where kind of Chomsky comes into the picture. I know Chomsky is kind of well, okay. So it turns out Chomsky was buddies with Jeffrey Epstein. So his reputation has taken a bit of a hit. Um, and rightly so. Okay. Um, but his criticism of Skinner's book Verbal Behavior showed quite clearly that language learning cannot be a matter of association and reinforcement, right? So mnemic causation, uh, little brain fart here. I actually have to go back to the book because I have forgotten what it means. So what page are we on? I think 80 something. Causal influence that leaps over a temporal gap with no intermediate links bridging cause and effect. Yeah. What Kim is saying is that it's perfectly reasonable to appeal if there's a different history of association and reinforcement between two individuals, then that's probably resulted in a difference in their internal states. And what's wrong with appealing to differences in those internal states? If we went just on the basis of behavior, we'd be missing those internal states, and that's what would be a problem. Oh, what have I said here? It leaves no room for the mental as well as the inner physical biological states. Oh, that's right, because it doesn't just skip mental states. It doesn't even look at, even if you look at everything in terms of straight up physiology, just what's happening in the brain and the nervous system. Uh, it's the history of association and reinforcement seems to miss all of that too. And that's a problem. So, how about number three? Psychological theories must make no reference to inner mental states in formulating psychological explanations. Can something like that work? Well, it doesn't seem to leave room for um, concepts that we need to make sense of to make sense of people's behavior. It doesn't seem to leave room for things like attention, memory, mental representations, information, etc. Um, So three is meant to rule out um, private intersubjective states. Um, I'll leave it to you to decide whether that means it rules out the aforementioned concepts like memory, attention, information, and mental representations. So, are we only talking about, does three only rule out consciousness, or is there room for talk of other mental states? Well, maybe we can take our cue from the sciences, right? In physics, for example, they posit plenty of things that are unobservable. Like, what are some things that are unobservable in physics? We can observe pretty small things in physics, right? I think with an electron microscope, we can see quite far down. We can see, protons and neutrons and electrons and stuff. I know we have some physicists in the class. Can somebody check that for me? Can someone confirm that? Yes. Oh, cool. Literally anything outside the visible spectrum, unless you use a spectrometer. Yeah, yeah. So those, right, right. But so I mean, there are things that are like really unobservable in the sense that they are theoretical entities. Um, yeah, Adrian, good point. And there's also the measurement problems. Yeah, the measurement problem. Well, string theory is silly. I'm sorry. Maybe I have no right to claim that because I'm not a physicist, but as a sort of as a philosopher, no, it's silly. Um, Call it string hypothesis, not string theory. Um, what I'm saying, and what Kim is saying is like, look, we've got things that we can observe, like indirectly, like with an electron microscope, I can see like protons and neutrons, but I can't see the quarks that are made that make them up. And the quarks have properties like up, down, charm, and strange. Those aren't observable. These are theoretical things that allow us to make predictions, and those predictions are successful, but no one's ever found a quark and looked at it and gone, "Oh, there's the charm, there's the up," right? So physicists are allowed these theoretical constructs. So why are the behaviorists so hardcore about like not having theoretical mental constructs like attention, memory, mental representations? They need not be. Like if the behaviorists want psychology to be a natural science, well, physicists have things like like Matthew says, we can't observe quantum numbers in electrons like spin. We only know because of the magnetic field experiments. And also, I mentioned the measurement problem. When we try to measure one of these things, we can measure some things, but not others. We can't measure it all, right? Um, but if physicists can have up quarks and down quarks and strange quarks and charm quarks, why can't we have memory and attention and mental representations? Like, come on, fair is fair. Um, so maybe we can allow these, even if they are unobservable, we can allow for these theoretical constructs in psychology, and we're not being poor natural scientists by doing so. Because of repeatability, what because of repeatability, Adrian? Do you mean like when we replicate experiments, or are you, yeah, yeah. Well, and again, like the behaviorism, the philosophical behaviorism that we've been talking about today emerged from logical positivism, which was a movement where we were talking again about the verification principle of meaning. So the only things that mattered were propositions we could formulate that had that were verifiable. We could They had verification conditions, and we could know whether a proposition was true or false by checking to see whether those verification conditions obtain. But around the same time as the Vienna Circle was talking about all of this stuff, there was a guy named Karl Popper who came along and said, look, what scientists do is they don't actually verify. What they do is they attempt to falsify. And that's why replicability in the sciences is so important. Because if you test your hypothesis and you fail to falsify it, that doesn't mean your hypothesis is true. But after multiple repeated attempts that fail to falsify the hypothesis, you can be reasonably certain that your hypothesis captures something true about the natural world, right? So anyway, I don't want to get all like philosophy of science on you, but that's another problem with behaviorism. It comes out of a scientific paradigm that we don't actually use anymore, which would be kind of cool if Kim talked about that in this chapter, but he doesn't. But it's fine because I just did, and that's what I'm here for. Anyway, to wrap up, in excluding private conscious states from psychological theory, number three excludes them from playing any causal explanatory role in relation to behavior. So we go back, right? This is this is three. Psychological theories must make no reference to inner mental states in formulating psychological explanations. But in doing so, they exclude these inner states from playing any causal explanatory role in relation to behavior. As I said before, like physicists don't do that with the unobservable properties of like quarks, right? So, if it is true as we ordinarily think that some of our behavior is caused by inner mental states disallowed by three, our psychological theory is likely to be incomplete. There may well be behavior for which no theory meeting 3 can provide full explanations. Basically, we need mental talk. Mental, we need to appeal to beliefs and desires, and we cannot just do it all on the basis of observable behavior. It doesn't work for so many reasons. Um, so this chapter has been pretty negative in terms of our evaluation of behaviorism, both logical and psychological. And that's why at the end here, Kim reiterates why behavior still remains important for the purposes of understanding the nature of the mind, right? Um, Firstly, the brain is the ontological, which is to say the existential base of the mind, which means that the brain and perhaps also the mind is the cause of behavior. Behavior is also the semantic foundation of mental language. What that means is that our behavior fixes the meanings of our mental expressions, our psychological expressions, right? The meaning of those expressions is grounded in our behavior and in the language games we play by making those utterances, by using those words to refer to what we use them to refer to. That's what grounds the meaning of mental terms like beliefs and desires. And behavior is the primary and almost exclusive evidence for the attribution of mental states to other beings with minds. Our knowledge of other minds depends on the observation of behavior. That doesn't mean we ought not to focus on unobservable mental states. That doesn't mean we ought to try and eliminate or reduce, like eliminate mental states or reduce mentality to behavior. But behavior is important. And even the introspectionists like James made note of that. So behaviorism, whether we're talking philosophical or psychological, does not work. But behavior is still important because behavior might be a mark of the mental, if William James is correct. Okay, that's all I have for today. Next week, on Monday, we're going to talk about the psychoneural identity theory. So please read that chapter in Kim. Mind as the Brain, I believe is the title. And remember also that your first reflection assignment, along with your proof of work, is due this Friday. I'm going to open the Dropbox, or maybe I have opened the Dropbox. I can't remember. I will double check that the Dropbox is open after I upload this lecture to YouTube. Remember that I want the final draft and at least 2 early drafts, which show incremental progress on your work. Remember to cite everything properly. Uh, that means a proper references section and in-text citations. These could be footnotes, endnotes, parenthetical references, doesn't matter. You need to have a references section and use in-text citations properly. I hope you've all had a look at the set of instructions that I posted, as well as the video where I gave an overview of those instructions. Oh, yes, you can do that. You can do it on paper and send a photo. That's fine. Someone says the volunteer note taker hasn't sent their notes. Let me look into that. Let me look into that. No, a draft cannot be bullet points. I want full sentences. If you do something with bullet points, that's going to be like draft 0. Yes, you can use this week's content. Anything up to and including this week is fair game. And you can even read ahead if you want to. Although I recommend going with what we've covered thus far. Storm, go ahead. I see your hands up there, but I can't hear you.
Can you hear me? Hello?
I can. Yes, now I can hear you.
Hi, Josh. Thank you. So just a quick question. I was taking a look at the Dropbox. So it looks like you have opened it. My question is just with regards to the proof of work, is it something where we can upload all these files in this one Dropbox?
Yes.
Okay,
So the Dropbox accepts multiple file submissions. So I actually recommend don't put it all in one file. Don't put it in a zip folder. Just like control click, grab all of your files and just put them all in the Dropbox at the same time. It makes it easier for Jack and I to look at them that way.
perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. And Tristan, no, the first draft doesn't need to meet the word count. Like I said, different people will do this different ways. Some might write part one for draft one, then finish off part two for draft two, and then their final draft would be like a polished up, edited, proofread thing. Some might start with a little of part one and part two and gradually expand. Some might write it all out, 750 words, but then give it a few edits, go over it a few times before they submit it. If you do this, you can use track changes to show the changes you make in your drafts. So there's more than one way to do this. I just want to make sure that your drafts show in some way or another the incremental progress you've made from starting to completing the assignment. Yeah, that's right, Tristan. No, you won't be penalized. Like I said, I just need to see that a human is doing the work. And I said, I know I trust you guys. I doubt very many of you will try and use AI. Um, well, Grant, it's up to you. I mean, use the template, right? Are timestamps going to matter? I'd submit everything at the same time. Just remember, use the save as feature. Save as draft one, draft two, final draft. Have them all as separate files. Highlight them all. Drag them all into the Dropbox, right? And again, I trust you. This is I hate that I have to do this, but I also think that doing this forces you to become better at writing. So there's a silver lining to the proof of work requirements. It's not that I think, oh, everyone's just going to use ChatGPT. No, but I do have to guard against that misuse of AI. But also, this is going to make you better at writing. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I think we should call it a day. And I know this has been like a tough one. This is a tricky chapter, even for me. Yeah, that's what I want to do. I just want to disappear. Um, so have a good one, everyone. If you do have questions, if you're watching this, if you're watching the recording and you have questions, send me an email or hop on the Discord server if you think that other people would benefit from the answer to your question. All right, thanks everyone. See you all next time. We'll talk about identity theory. A little easier than this chapter.
But
Yes, someone needs
I,
to speak to me. Let me just stop recording. Okay. All right.
yeah.
See you next week, everybody.